Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are so glad to have you all here with us this evening. I'm Alyssa Hunt, and I'm the program director at the Alice Paul Institute. And we are really excited to bring this program to all of you tonight to talk about women in the vote, to continue the conversations that we began last year, and to this time be able to bring a more global perspective to the conversation and to help us all gain some insight and understanding about the way this is affecting women all over the world. We are really honored to have 4 experts in their respective areas talking about different regions of the world with us tonight. And before I introduce all of them and let them talk about themselves, I want to turn it over to Sarah Curitan from the state of New Jersey, who helped us plan this evening.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Curitan, and I'm the Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission. And it's my honor tonight to bring you greetings from the extraordinary woman who leads the New Jersey Department of State, the Honorable Tahisha Way. Secretary Way was not able to be with us tonight, but I want you all to know that her commitment to history, and particularly to women's history, is strong and passionate. The Historical Commission is delighted to partner with the Alice Paul Institute in bringing you tonight's program, which is offered in celebration of Women's History Month. I might add that we have a second program coming up on Monday, March 29th at 1 p.m., titled Rising Together, Black Sororities in Pursuit of Leadership and Service. You can register for it at our website, history.nj.gov, and I certainly hope you'll join us then too. Now, while the New Jersey Historical Commission focuses on the history of our state, tonight we are very appropriately looking beyond our borders to gain a global perspective on issues that directly affect women around the world. Like you, I'm eager to hear from our distinguished speakers, so welcome and thank you for joining us this evening.
So I am going to allow all our panelists to introduce themselves fully because they will do a much better job than I will. And we are going to start with Dr. Sonia Palmieri.
Hi, thank you very much for joining the panel. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm the Gender Policy Fellow with the Department of Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. It's a new role for me, actually, and I've come to that really on the back of an academic background, but also a very strong practitioner background in the area of women's political participation and leadership. And in particular, a very long-standing commitment to understanding better the leadership and political participation of women in the Pacific. And I've done that from various institutions like the Interparliamentary Union, the UN Women, the Australian Parliament, and as a consultant myself. So thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. Dr. Bauer.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. So I believe I'm here on behalf of my former graduate student, Chiedo Nwankwo, who was not available, and it's a pleasure to take her place. I'm a professor of political science and international relations at the University of Delaware. I teach African politics and gender in politics, and I conduct research on women's political leadership in Africa. Most recently, that's the last decade or so, I've been working in Ghana, and I've been looking in particular at why there's such a low representation of women in Ghana's parliament, in strong contrast to a number of other African countries that actually lead the world. And then more recently, my co-author from the University of Ghana and I have done some work on women in cabinet in Ghana and why there's no gender parity cabinet in Ghana, even though there are a number of others across the African continent. I've also done research in other countries, significantly like Namibia and Botswana. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Dr. Young-Im Lee.
Hello, I'm Young-Im Lee. I'm an assistant professor of political science at California State University in Sacramento. I teach comparative politics, gender politics, and Northeast Asian politics, mainly Taiwan, China, Korea, North Korea, South Korea, Japan. And I am here to talk about Asia. And Asia being such a big continent, I'm mainly going to focus on Northeast Asia, which is my expertise. So I mainly study legislative elections, especially the use of gender quotas in East Asia, how gender quotas promote women's numerical representation, as well as policy responsiveness for women, and also the long-term impact of gender quotas. And more recently, I am actually doing studies on Park Geun-hye, who was the first female president of South Korea and who was also impeached. So I'm exploring how sexism has influenced people's support for impeachment and how people evaluate her political legacy when it comes to gender equality.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Jennifer Piscopo, who's joining us once again, was here with us in November.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me back. It's such a pleasure to be back with the Alice Paul Institute and to also join the New Jersey Historical Commission. So I'm Jennifer Piscopo. I'm an associate professor of politics at Occidental College in Los Angeles, California. And my research is on women and elected office in Latin America and in the United States. And Latin America is actually the region in the world right now that elects the most women to Congress. And so I hope in a little bit to tell you why that is the case. So I do research to understand, right, why Latin America has succeeded so well when other countries, including the United States, have not. And more recently this year, I've been doing work with UN Women on the question of whether or not women leaders were better pandemic performers. I'm a little doubtful about that idea. And also looking at how countries are developing gender sensitive and gender inclusive pandemic responses.
Thank you. To start the program, I want to think a little bit about national efforts in various regions to promote women's political participation, what's helping and what's hindering that. And because there is so much focus on what's going on in Australia, kind of in the political arena right now, and it parallels ours a little bit, I'm going to ask you to start with that, Sonia.
Well, that's an interesting question. What helps political participation? I think, as all of the panelists will say, quotas help the political participation of women. They have always been known as a fast-track measure to increase the number of women in Parliament. I'm not always a fan of talking about quotas as the only measure, mostly because I'm not convinced that the quota system and the quotas are the way to improve the culture of Parliament. So quotas are there to improve the numbers of women in Parliament. To improve the culture, which is really at the heart of the problem here in Australia at the moment, and to be honest, part of the problem in the Pacific as well, quotas one part of the story, but not the only part. And I think what we really do need to see is a much stronger appreciation of the value of gender equality in the first instance, and then having understood why gender equality is really important, not just as a kind of an additional outcome that Parliament should be working towards, but as a primary objective of everything that the Parliament does and the way in which the Parliament's work is structured as a workplace, then institutionalising specific measures within that parliamentary workplace. So things like gender mainstreaming across the legislative process, the budgetary process, ensuring that there are opportunities for debates on gender equality to allow that perspective to come in, to ensure consultation with gender advocates and gender experts across every kind of aspect of the political participation. I'm sorry, I'm just going to take an extra minute, but yesterday I was chairing a panel about the gendered impact of COVID, and it is obvious across the world, and not least in Australia, that the gendered impacts of COVID were researched, documented, evidenced, and yet there were always policy gaps in the responses to that. And so that for me suggests that parliaments haven't yet understood how to address that gender differentiation in terms of policy impact, legislative impact. Thanks.
Youngin, I saw you nodding your head really just vigorously in response to what Sonia was just saying. Do you have something you can add, or a way you were just talking in your introduction about the way that sexism played into this outcome for the prime minister in South Korea? Do you feel like those are related issues maybe?
I think I was nodding because what Sonia was describing about the impact of COVID, and which is more heavily felt by women and also, you know, the marginalized community. I was just nodding because I remember reading or the added burden of women being caretaker and being there for emotional support and providing, you know, everything. And I was just immediately thinking about my mom. And I was trying to write something about this women in abstract, how like, you know, women are being negatively impacted by it. I was reading it and I was thinking, wait a second, I'm actually reading about my mom. So I was just nodding because I could feel that kind of personal connection to the issue.
Do you feel there's a sense in which the way that this burden is falling disproportionately gendered, that also affects our like women's outcomes in political leadership?
Yeah, for sure. And the thing is, so the South Korea now, the presidential election is going to happen. So there are those potential, you know, presidential candidates who's going to be the next potential presidential candidates. And then I was looking at the recent public opinion poll, which was published yesterday. There was only one woman whose name was being floated, and her public support was 2%, right? And all the other men, those who were either the President Moon Jae-in, the incumbent president, who was hailed as one of the, you know, who led this very successful effort in South Korea to overcome the pandemic. That pandemic, because the incumbent government president did a very good job. Now the whole narrative about elections is about the effective, you know, a man becoming a really effective leader during the time of political crisis. We cannot have, you know, women to be the next president. So I think in some ways, even though South Korea was the first country in the world holding the national level election last year, and women, there was a historic increase of women in the parliament, but still when it comes to very top national level executive leadership, when it comes to, you know, women, the second president, people still cannot really wrap their head around having another, you know, woman as the leader, because the last one who was elected was such a disaster. So because of the incumbent president's very successful performance, I think in some ways it kind of confirmed that men, at least in the South Korean context, could become a very effective leader in times of political crisis. Whereas the first female leader actually caused a lot of crisis.
That reminds me of a phenomenon I learned recently called the glass cliff, where women are brought in when, you know, institutions are in trouble and they're given kind of an impossible situation. When they don't succeed, they're blamed and used as an example of how women can't, you know, hold these positions or fail. Gretchen, are you seeing these same kinds of things mirrored, or is it a really different situation in your experiences in looking at representation or the lack thereof?
So to go off of Young Im's comments about COVID and I guess women leaders, and I know Dr. Piscopo has a lot to say about that as well. We've read your articles in my class and my students really enjoy you know, your great insights. So COVID-19 has not brought, you know, a wave of women leaders to Africa, either in legislative elections or in executive level elections. But what has happened, I can just cite last week in Tanzania, the leader of Tanzania, the president of Tanzania passed away, we all believe, from COVID. And he was one of the continent's greatest COVID deniers and really wasn't taking any precautions at all for his population of 60 million people. He had a woman vice president, a Muslim woman vice president, who has now been sworn in as the president of the country. And that has happened in another case as well in Malawi a few years ago. And that one was very interesting because it actually took them 48 hours to decide if the vice president really was to become the president, because of course it was Joyce Banda, a woman. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, of course, is the first, democratically elected woman president in Africa. And she came into a post-conflict setting and one in which there was no incumbent, right? So it was kind of a founding election that they held in 2005 following a transition. And that's how a lot of the accomplishments in Africa in the realm of women's participation in politics and decision-making have come about in post-conflict settings. New constitutions, new electoral laws, significant mobilization and pressure from women's organizations and the like. So that's a long answer to the question about COVID and women leaders.
And I do want to eventually get to more general conversation about women in politics, but while we're talking about women leaders and COVID, Jen, do you want to share some of the research you've been doing?
Sure. So when we talk about women leaders, often people are talking about heads of government and heads of state, right? So who's in charge? And one artifact of COVID, right, has been that it's concentrated policymaking in the executive branch. So even though we see rising numbers of women in parliament and all these global regions, COVID-19 policymaking has largely happened in the executive. So when this story sort of emerged about a year ago, this idea that women presidents and prime ministers were better at containing COVID relative to men, one of the things that I thought about as someone who studies global politics was, well, where are the women presidents and prime ministers right now? So about 10 years ago, most women presidents and prime ministers were concentrated in what we would call the global South countries, underdeveloped or emerging democracies. Latin America had 4 women presidents. There were women leaders in Africa, as Gretchen just mentioned, right? But that's actually not the case in 2020. Latin America no longer has any women presidents. There's no women primed to be president of any of the Latin American countries that are having elections in 2021. Starting in 2020, when the pandemic arrived, a flip of the pattern was that most women leaders were heading global, what we would call global North countries, wealthy, industrialized countries that are also democracies. Scandinavia, Iceland, New Zealand, Taiwan. So I said, wait a minute, is it that women are leading, that women leaders are better, or are women more likely in this particular moment to be elected in the kinds of countries that already have strong capacity to contain a pandemic? Okay, Iceland and New Zealand are islands, that really helps, right? But these are also countries that already have strong public health sectors. They have strong state investment in stable and partial bureaucracies. They have high levels of citizen trust in government. These are all factors, right, that should lead to stronger pandemic containment. And so my early research was sort of pushing this idea, not to say that gender wasn't part of the story, but that the idea was, why are women leaders more likely to be elected now in the global North rather than the global South? And so it's really about the patterns of women's election that are driving these outcomes that we think are about pandemic performance.
Could the argument be made, though, that these places, even though there's a lot of confounding variables, but there are a lot of other countries that were also primed to be able to contain pandemics that didn't. So could it be gendered policy outcomes that is driving that? And that's a question for anyone. I'm very interested to hear all of your thoughts on what kinds of different policy priorities and outcomes we see when we have women in charge. Or if that's,
I'll just, so we've sort of thought about UN Women, right? What are the countries that seem to have pandemic policy responses that are the most gender sensitive? And so some of the standout countries at the moment are Canada, Argentina, Chile, actually the state of Hawaii. And so those are not necessarily countries that are led by women, but an important feature is actually that there are women in high positions of power, both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch, who have influence over that chief executive's decision-making, right? So Argentina is actually a case where you have a man president, he's on the left, he's quite open to gender equality, and there's a very strong network of feminist legislators and feminist ministers who have worked really hard in identifying the gender dimensions of COVID and getting those dimensions in front of the president. So it's still the case that women's voices and influence matter, but it's really about the kinds of connectivity that women and particularly feminist policymakers have to whoever the decision maker is. So even if the decision maker is ultimately a guy, like Justin Trudeau or Alberto Fernandez in Argentina, if they are open to considering the gender dimensions of COVID and responding to those dimensions, then we can still see that people elevating those concerns can gain influence. And I'd love to, I'll yield now because I'd love to hear what my colleagues see in their regions.
I'd like to add just briefly about Taiwan. I was mainly talking about South Korea before. I mean, Taiwan, President Tsai Ing-wen was so successful, not only because one, like Taiwan is relatively smaller island, so maybe that has something to do with it, similar to New Zealand, it's easier to contain, but also the rivalry between mainland China and Taiwan is so critical. And even though I read those, a lot of news articles in the US and in English publications, we should not use, terms like Wuhan virus or China virus. But when I actually read Chinese language news articles in Taiwan, there's, at least until last year, they were still saying Wuhan virus in Chinese. So this rivalry, we are different from mainland China, and this pandemic started from China. So we need to really show to the world we have control over this pandemic. I think that kind of nationalistic sentiment also played a role in Taiwan to mobilize people and kind of help people to kind of follow what the government mandate people to do. So I think it's about gender. I mean, Tsai Ing-wen is such an effective leader, and also the Taiwanese government is very well functioning, but also that kind of interesting rivalry between mainland China and Taiwan, I think that actually played a significant role in mobilizing people.
So I would say that what's been happening across Africa is actually quite interesting. And of course, it's absolutely impossible to generalize across 54 countries, right? But, there has been nothing like the death rate in African countries that there has been in most other parts of the world, right? And in part, that's because, only 3% of the population is over the age of 65, right? People are very, very young across Africa. Older people don't live in long-term care facilities, right? Climate, probably does have something to do with it in the sense that people gather outside, right? They don't, they may dwell at night in multi-generational dwellings, but not during the day, right? And also the whole issue of less travel from outside the continent. And so the pandemic has been fairly well located among the elite, really. And so, there have been significant losses among the elite. But I would also say that, even women legislators have not, from my observation, been particularly involved. And as has been said, it's a very executive-driven response. And I would also say that many countries did respond very quickly, right? And, a lot of countries are used to outbreaks of epidemics and so on and so forth, and so have those measures in place.
Thanks, everyone. I know that Jennifer has actually, in the course of her work for UN Women, has written to me on a number of occasions trying to identify where in the Pacific we might find examples of women's leadership on COVID. And it hasn't been an easy question to answer. Like, interestingly, as Gretchen was saying, in terms of Africa, in the Pacific, the rates, with the exception of Papua New Guinea, which is at the moment experiencing a massive outbreak, for the most part, COVID has been contained because, again, as Jung Im said, these are islands, travel was restricted. I am literally not allowed to leave my country, and I can't even go to New Zealand. So, in this part of the world, the containment of COVID has been because of travel restrictions. And that has also meant massive consequences for the economies of these countries. So, because tourism is a massive source of income. And so, while the health outcomes have been relatively good, again, with the exception of Papua New Guinea, the domestic economy has suffered significantly. And last year for UN Women, Professor Sarah Childs and I did a primer to help parliaments respond gender sensitively to COVID. And one thing that struck us both very early on was that in responding to COVID, governments generally had taken the approach of taking the advice from health experts. So when Jane was talking before, I was like, well, yes, of course, the policymakers have to be gender sensitive, but I'm also intrigued by the number of chief medical officers who have been women and the relationship between those chief medical officers and the heads of state, the leaders, whether they're male or female. But if that source of advice from the health professionals was gender sensitive, that's clearly a really important indicator in the outcomes. But I'd also say that while, you know, in a world of post-truth and you know, facts are not necessarily important in policy making, the fact that health professionals did have such a huge impact in the policy responses to COVID is really important. But what the really important missing element always is gender experts. So gender experts might be, yes, in the health field, but they might be in lots of other areas. And that source of advice is still not being heard sufficiently.
There's so much information that all of you just shared. It's really astounding how much, we're not in a room, but how much knowledge is just kind of out there right now. But I do want to shift gears a little bit because I don't want to just talk about women policy leaders and COVID, but something that I mentioned a little bit before and you have all touched on is about policy. And I am really interested to hear your thoughts on the policy priorities, just, you know, writ large, that we see when women are in these positions of power, and if there's a relationship between that and between those policy priorities and engagement of women in the general public in like when you see women, do they in leadership positions, do they create or enforce policies that make more women run for office or participate in elections? Is there a correlation there? And Young Em, I'm going to ask you if you'll start this conversation.
Yeah, I can immediately think of Taiwan. I just wrote a paper about Taiwan's first term in the presidential office, and there are a lot of studies showing when there's a women president or prime minister, that they tend to nominate more women cabinet members, and not only just on a more traditionally considered like feminine areas, but even more high, like masculine areas, and high profile cabinet positions. But that has not been the case in South Korea and actually in Taiwan as well. Even though I said highly about President Tsai Ing-wen when it comes to her response to COVID, during her especially the first term, the number of women appointed as a cabinet members has decreased. And when she was inaugurated for the second time after her re-election, the number went down to 10%. So there was a protest by feminist and women's organizations saying those, pickets saying this is the most male cabinet member in the Taiwanese history. So during her presidency, when it comes to cabinet appointments, her administration's performance was rather disappointing. And that has been the case for Park Geun-hye as well. And the second, Taiwan is the first in Asia now legalizing same-sex marriage. That is one of the most, for some, exciting accomplishment of her presidency. However, her administration was being criticized for not really being proactive. So when Tsai Ing-wen ran for the president for the second time, she said, "I support marriage equality. I'm going to work to promote legalization of same-sex marriage." But once she was actually elected, the government was very, very passive about really pushing the agenda forward. So there was a lot of frustration. And eventually, again, same-sex marriage is legalized, but because of the party, internal party conflicts and also electoral calculations, Tsai Ing-wen could not really promote same-sex marriage as aggressively as she promised that she would. On the other end, Park Geun-hye was considered, because she hailed from a conservative political party, she didn't really get any credit for promoting women's rights. And also her being the daughter of the ex-dictator, a lot of people didn't give her credit that she didn't make the name for herself. She just became the president because she's the daughter of Park Geun-hye. However, when I actually analyzed her administration's budget on gender-related policies, it actually expanded a lot. And in terms of the policy areas, the group of people who are benefited from the government policies has expanded. It's not only about women, but also men. So not only maternity leave, but also paternity leave. And not only like native-born women, but also a lot of immigrant women who are being benefited. And there are a lot of policies, again, expanding the concept of gender equality. So even though Park Geun-hye, because she was a woman, people had that expectation that she was going to promote a policy, she's going to promote gender equality. And then because of, again, her not very successful performance, people didn't give her credit. But when I look at the budget and the number, she actually did promote. So I will say in Northeast Asia, I think the performance is kind of mixed. A lot of people have high expectations of women, but when it comes to them actually doing something, there are a lot of realistic barriers they have to surmount to promote their agenda. But at the same time, even though maybe those leaders themselves didn't really want to do a lot of feminist-related policies, but because of the pressure and expectation, well, you're the first women, so probably you need to do something. So probably willingly and unwillingly, those women have promoted gender equality in some ways. So I will say it's the result is a little bit mixed.
Gretchen, would you like to add?
Sure, I would like to. So as I mentioned before, there's not a lot of experience with women presidents and prime ministers. So I'll speak more about women in parliament. So what happens when women get into parliament? And I think, as the panelists would know, we typically measure these impacts in terms of substantive representation and symbolic representation effects, right? And so the former refers to, adopting policy agendas, passing new laws, right? And then the latter would refer to some of the things that you mentioned earlier, Alyssa, like, do you inspire more women and girls to become involved in politics? Do you alter people's ideas about, who can be a political leader and so on and so forth? And so it's kind of interesting because in my view, in many African countries, sometimes these symbolic representation effects can be even more important just because legislatures are weak. We talk about strong executives and the corollary to that is weak legislatures. But it has also been the case, research has shown us that in 3 areas in particular, women, when they get into parliament in African countries, have played a big role in new laws. And those have been in the areas of gender-based violence, family law, and land rights. And that's not surprising, right? Because those are all areas that would particularly affect women. And then also some of the early research refers to something that I think Sonia mentioned earlier, which is parliamentary cultures, right? And whether or not getting more women into parliament. And, here you have to get a lot more women into parliament, right? To try to change those parliamentary cultures. The challenges are enormous still, but I'll save that for later.
Jen?
Great. So to give a little context in Latin America, right? So most Latin American countries extended suffrage to women in the post-World War II era. So about 1940, 1950, and through the 1960s, across Spanish and Portuguese-speaking Latin America, women gained the right to vote. Some of you probably know that after that, Latin America went through a period of different kinds of instability in different countries, dictatorships, and civil wars. As countries in the region redemocratized, starting roughly in about the 1980s, one of the important features there was that in most Latin American countries, and this is still true today, voting was mandatory. You have to vote. And the focus there is not like we have in the United States, where there's all these kinds of barriers to vote and different regions can create different rules for voting. Because of Latin America's experience with war and dictatorship, the focus was voting is essential to democracy and it's very easy to vote. One of the things I like to point out to my students is voting, for instance, happens on a Sunday, right? It's not just obligatory, it happens on a Sunday. It's almost a national holiday and everyone goes to vote. So the conversations in Latin America are thinking about suffrage, not just as the right to vote, but as the right to elect, which is the right to vote, and be elected. And in fact, many of these constitutions that were made as Latin America re-democratized put in legal terms this dual definition of suffrage, the right to elect and the right to be elected. So being elected is about getting elected to office, which is what most of us are talking about, and closing the gap with women's election to political office. So in Latin America, women's movements starting in the 1980s demanded not the protection of their right to vote, that was there, but the protection of their right to be elected. So in that initial round where we went around and we talked about gender quotas, so these are laws that were pioneered in Latin America due to the pressure of women's movements, picked up in other world regions, even including Europe, that require political parties to run certain percentages of women candidates. They're designed to close that gap, and they're designed to be a mechanism to ensure that women's suffrage, understood as the right to elect and be elected, is being protected. So in Latin America today, we actually have 10 countries that require gender parity among political candidates, including Mexico, our closest neighbor here in the United States. And that's one of the reasons that Latin America leads in the proportion of women in Congress, because 16 of the 18 Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries have some form of gender quota, 10 having gender parity. And an important priority for women in Latin America has been to make these gender quotas work, because it's not just getting the law passed on paper, it's getting the law enforced such that political parties are accountable for nominating the requisite number of women, that political parties are punished when they do not, and that women are actually filling, not just running, but winning those elections and filling those seats. And when we talk about policy priorities for women, that's actually one area that in Latin America, women have worked across the aisle on. Because no matter whether they're on the left or the right, having gender quotas in place that work and that are enforced benefit women of all ideologies, right? Now that's had other consequences. A gender quota applies to all political parties equally, right? So you're gonna have similar proportions of women entering representing different ideologies. And so there might be areas where those ideologies are going to inhibit agreement, inhibit working across the aisle. But when it comes to women's political careers, we actually see, at least in Latin America, women willing to work across the aisle on that issue.
Yeah, it's so interesting and so different from how we do things, just so dramatically different from how we do things in the United States. And Sonia, I think things are done a bit differently where you are as well, that parties win elections more than individuals, right? Am I understand, at least for leadership?
So I might also do a Jen and kind of give a little bit of context to the region and just to differentiate between the Pacific and what we might kind of call Australia and New Zealand, which are technically part of the Pacific, but I actually just wanted to take a minute to think about the rest of the Pacific. So if we take the IPU's latest statistics, the average of women in national parliaments in lower and unicameral parliaments is, as of the beginning of this year, 25.6%. Now, the IPU also has a regional classification, and for the Pacific, what it defines as the Pacific, in lower and unicameral parliaments, the average is 18%. However, that percentage is inflated because it takes into account New Zealand, which is ranked 5th at the moment in the world at almost parity, 48.3%, and Australia, again in the lower house, not doing quite as well as New Zealand, but still over 30%. So if you take those two countries out of the 18% regional average, you actually end up with 8.4%. So that is the regional percentage of women in national parliaments across the Pacific Island countries. The real issue here is that, and this isn't really talked about very often, but they are late to independence, these countries. So in most of those countries, suffrage really wasn't granted until the mid to late 1960s. So in addition to that, you have a tension between what is known as democratic governance, so these new kind of Western style parliaments that were almost imposed as a kind of colonial gift. I use the word gift not in the best sense, but also what is known as traditional governance. And in traditional governance, there is a very strong role of men making decisions. So that obviously has an impact on an area of research which I'm always very, very fascinated about, which is around social norms. So it's social norms that really determine the participation and leadership of women in the Pacific, because those social norms tend to characterize leadership as something that men do. So it's not just about what is appropriate, but it's literally the practice. There are traditional governance structures which are just inhabited by men. So that kind of influences the day-to-day understanding of who makes decisions and how those decisions are made in the Pacific. Some research that I've been doing with the amazing Karen Baker has been to relate that success, where women are successful, to think about their relationship to men. So often where we see women who have been successful in the Pacific, we see them related to or married to a man. And so, you know, we've done a really small piece on widows and wives, which actually we were both astounded to realise has been a traditional pathway of women in parliament across the world. It's just that this is where the Pacific is at the moment. But in America, in the United States, we were blown away that actually many, many women have been the wives or widows of a male MP. So that was really fascinating for us. But I think, to get back to the question, I really just wanted to contextualize some of this. For me, the relationship between women in parliament and gendered policy outcomes is not just about the women, as I said before, but as Gretchen said, about that culture, and about the ways in which MPs are supported to make gender sensitive policy outcomes and review as well, because parliaments are also supposed to do oversight, right? So how do they do that? Well, they have to have access to the right kinds of advice. They have to have access to sex disaggregated data. They have to have processes in place. And something I'm looking a lot more into at the moment, because I'm fascinated by it, is that in the Fijian parliament in about 2014, they amended the standing orders, so the rules of procedure, to ensure that when parliamentary committees did their reviews, they had to take into account the principle of gender equality. So that means that every member of the 6 standing committees, whether they're male or female, has to, by the rules of procedure, look at the issue from a gender perspective. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is done really thoroughly, but the importance is the standing order. So this is research that I'm doing, and hopefully we'll have a lot more to say about that in the next year or so. But it's really, for me, it's really about what are the processes? How can we support members of parliament to do this work, to look at the gendered impacts of policy and programs?
Thank you, that was outstanding. Gretchen, you wanted to touch on this as well.
Yes, so I know, again, we're talking about policy impacts, but I wanted to get a little bit of that history in there as well. And, you know, I think that in many African countries, again, despite having so many world leaders in Africa, the struggle is still about getting women into parliament, right? And so similar to what Sonia just described again, most African countries have been independent since 1960 at best, right? So that's 60 years. And so it was at that time that men and women at the same time got the right to vote and to stand for office. And then, in a somewhat similar trajectory, although years later to Latin America, the first 30 years of independence in many countries was single party rule and military rule. And again, I think that's very important, talking about these social norms. What has been the legacy of military rule for so many African countries and for women's participation in politics? I have written an article about this. But then more recently, as Jen suggested, a transition to more democratic politics over the last 30 years. So it's really only the last 30 years that we're looking at when we look at women's increased presence in these institutions. And something that we haven't talked about, and again, we don't want to get down into the weeds, but in Africa, what really makes a difference is the type of electoral system. And so those, Anglophone, British-speaking, former British colony countries that use the single-member district system that we also use here in the United States are the laggards, right? And that's because, that is considered the woman-unfriendly electoral system, right? And it's the hardest one to add, a good electoral gender quota to. And in contrast to what Jen said, what a number of African countries have done with those electoral systems is use reserved seats, which are a different type of quota, than a candidate quota, right? So again, I just wanted to kind of stress that in a lot of African countries, that remains the struggle to get more women into office.
So I want to, if now is a good moment, unless anyone has anything else to add to this particular issue, I want to go over to some of the questions we've been getting from attendees. And going back to, I think that came up when Young Im was speaking about like gender equality and appointing women cabinet members, if maybe there's a sense of like part of that structural misogyny and sexism, that if a woman gets elected, that there's a cultural sense or structural sense in the political system that she owes the men who helped her get there, and so therefore has to keep men around her. Is that something that is that a pressure people are facing?
Yeah, so in the case of Taiwan, when I interviewed people who worked with her, who were considered as her right arm, I think that's the term people use, like, why didn't she appoint more women? And the common response was because like politics, still Taiwan being relatively gender equal society, still politics is considered to be men's world. And Taiwan had to prove herself to be the president. So once she was elected, she really wanted to keep some distance from the feminist agenda. She didn't want to be labeled as a woman or feminist president. She just wanted to be the president, right? So I think, people, the interviews told me she probably had the kind of pressure that she didn't want to play the gender card. She didn't want to appeal as a feminist or a politician. So she wanted to be even more wanting to be even almost harsher to women. Well, I had to prove myself, so you also need to prove yourself. So even though there were a lot of pressure from the feminist movement that finally we need to really promote gender equality, I think Taiwan, as being the minority in the very male-dominated field, she kind of felt the pressure. I didn't want to play the gender card. And that's one. In the case of South Korea, the problem is Park Geun-hye, again, she didn't become the president because she was a feminist or women's politician. She tapped into the familiar ties. So the connection between the regime, between the government and the social movement, the women's and feminist movement, was very weak. So when it comes to pool of women, her administration has a very limited pool of women whom they can recruit potential people. So I think that was a problem for Park Geun-hye. Whereas in Taiwan, even the civil society and the institutionalized forms of politics has been very strong. The leader herself didn't really want to nominate a lot of women. So there's no one kind of uniform like mechanism why there is this kind of disconnect between the presence of prime minister and president and more women in the cabinet positions.
I wanted to add, reflect on that. I think Young Im is exactly right. And what Young Im is calling our attention to, right, is that women leaders are politicians, right? So they're rational actors. They're going to respond to the incentives that are the product of the political moment. And one of the other things that we know about women leaders is that they are still, though, judged on different standards relative to men. So for a man president or prime minister to say appoint a gender parity cabinet can be seen as magnanimous and forward thinking. Think about Justin Trudeau with Canada's gender parity cabinet, just his blasé, well, it's 2015. For a woman president or prime minister to appoint a gender parity cabinet could be read very differently. It could be seen as favoritism. It could be seen as weakness. And so often women might appoint fewer women, not because they are not internally committed to gender equality, but because their actions are read differently, their actions are read in gender terms, and so they're more constrained by the political situation, right? And they have to navigate this very carefully. You know, I saw that one of the audience members made a reference to Michelle Bachelet in Chile. It's absolutely true that Michelle Bachelet in Chile was quite clear about her feminist commitments, but she still had to tread carefully. Chile, she did not lead Chile to adopting a gender quota during her first term. She did not lead Chile to liberalizing abortion during her first term, not because she was not personally committed to those issues, but as a woman president and as the first woman president, it was much more difficult for her to maneuver and for her to push on these issues. And so again, we can see instances where often it's easier for a man to act because his actions are sort of read by the public differently. And so that's why I was, challenging this idea that women are better pandemic performers, because the flip side of celebrating women as magical unicorns is the outsized disappointment when they seem to not deliver. And so we have to be careful about avoiding that outsized disappointment, even as we engage in outside celebration, because the rational calculations are not the same for women and for men.
Which actually leads me, as we kind of come to the end, just I want to ask about your reflections on the relationship between feminism and like feminist ideologies and female representation in government. I think this is, we're seeing a lot of pushback in the United States against this idea of feminism and woman as like monoliths, as single things. We have lots of feminisms, we have lots of women and lots of ways to be women. So is there a relationship in countries that are having like more emergent like female representation in legislatures, in higher cabinet positions? Are they tied to feminist movements, or are those really different issues? I know it's a big question, but Sonia, can I ask you to jump on that one?
Oh, it's so hard, but it's a really good question. Can I just put two hats on? First of all, let me talk about Australia. We constantly have quite an interesting debate about the role of feminism and the declaration of a feminism among women MPs. So we've had women who have absolutely rejected the label. And yet, if you look at some of their initiatives, have been feminists, subterfuge feminists in practice. And we've had other women in senior government positions declare themselves as feminists, and yet we still haven't seen the consequences, or what you would imagine would be the consequences of that feminism in terms of the kind of outcomes that the government produces. So for me, it's all very well and good to call yourself a feminist, but I'd like to see some evidence of that in practice. the flip side, of course, is, you know, if you don't call yourself a feminist and you do that because the party does not want you to be a feminist, does not want you to allegedly pander to these sectoral interests, which is, you know, gender equality, then, you know, you are trying to maintain peace within the party. So I think that's a really important point. In the Pacific, feminism, I think, takes on so many different forms, and I think it's a constant form of resistance. So it is actually sometimes a very dangerous hat to be wearing, because you mark yourself quite distinctively. And I think it's important to realize that those women who do call themselves feminists in the Pacific are vilified, have been trolled. I mean, there are some amazing examples of women MPs in Fiji who have had the most vitriolic responses to their declarations of feminism. So I think we need to kind of also be aware of the consequences of declaring yourself a feminist in that context. But excellent question, thank you.
So I can speak briefly about this, you know, based on my experience working in Africa and the African friends that I have. One could talk for a long time on this topic. I mean, for example, you know, some people have referred to feminism in different African settings as the F word, right? So not a word that is, you know, heartily embraced. It's often portrayed as, you know, being something that comes from the outside, you know, Western influenced and so on and so forth, although there is a very vibrant African feminism, and, you know, African feminists were among those who responded to, you know, the first generations of feminism in the United States and so on and so forth. But I would also say that, you know, any discussion of feminism in Africa today raises the question that we haven't talked at all about, which is young people, right? And so it's among young women, I think, that you will see a very strong embrace of feminism these days. Those women are very active on social media, right? And you know, they are kind of getting the word out. I don't think most people make any assumption that, you know, women elected to parliament are necessarily feminists, right? I just want to make one comment to in response to what Sonia said about not even the word feminist, but again, interviewing women members of parliament about whether they represent women's interests, right? And oftentimes the answer is no, 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 you know, I represent my constituents. But then, you know, as you said, 10 or 20 minutes into the conversation, they will tell you about all the things they have done for women. So that's how I respond to this question.
Young Em or Jen?
Go ahead, Young Em.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, in Taiwan, so some of the feminist legislators, they're the like, fierce supporters of same-sex marriage and LGBTQ rights. So I think in Taiwan, there's this kind of affinity between the feminist movement and LGBTQ movement, and they have a kind of symbiotic relationship, and they have made quite a lot of policy progress. But in South Korea, so very interesting new phenomenon is this group called men in their 20s. So that's a kind of really strong backlash against a lot of the advancement made in the early 1990s and early 2000s. So those men, now they're in their 20s, they have this internalized sense of lost because of affirmative action, because of a lot of investment on girls when it comes to, you know, performance in school, or, you know, they have lost or the privilege coming from military service or whatnot. So now we start to see these younger men, whereas women in their 20s are fierce, a lot of them are fierce feminists, but there's this group of people emerging, men in their 20s. When we do like public opinion surveys, even compared to older generations, when it comes to gender equality related attitude questions, men in their 20s are more socially conservative than men in their 40s and 50s. So that's a kind of an interesting kind of backlash of feminism in South Korea.
So in general, right, we tend to think about suffrage as sort of the first wave of women's movements, right? That was sort of an initial eruption of feminism onto the political stage. And then you have sort of the later second generation in the US, right, centered on the 1960s and the movement for the ERA, sort of second wave feminism, and then, you know, so on into later generations. If we think about the Latin American experience, right, as I mentioned, that this first wave, right, the suffrage movements happened in the 1940s and the 1950s and 1960s. And I saw that one of the guests wanted to know about how countries thought historically about their suffragists, right? In the Latin American context, what happened after suffrage, right, was a period of de-democratization. It was civil wars, it was military dictatorships. And so then democratization occurred in the 1980s in tandem with second wave feminism sweeping the globe. So in Latin America, democratization and feminism went together in the 1980s because of the number of women that were participating in pro-democracy movements. And in Latin America, the historical experience is really centered on that more recent moment, right? The efforts to recuperate memory, not that the colonial past and the pre-World War II past isn't important, but it's very much about who were the democratic leaders, who were the leaders of the refounding of democracy in the 1980s, and who were the women that participated in that process. There was a real decline of street mobilization in Latin America then in the 1990s and in the 2000s, right? Democracy was back, things were more or less okay. I mean, this is a very stylized history, all right? And the focus was on getting women elected into office. What I think is really fascinating about Latin America right now are the youth movements. If you've been paying attention to Latin America right now, there's a new moment for women in feminist movement. We could think about it as a third wave for Latin America, where young women from Mexico to Guatemala to Chile to Uruguay to Argentina are angry about persistent discrimination. They are taking to the streets. They are marching, demonstrating, they are occupying university buildings and demanding that professors be held accountable for sexual harassment in universities. And it's actually this sort of moment that for those of us that study Latin America, we feel like we're back in the heady days of democratization in the 1980s again, when we look at the kind of street activism that's happening. And it's predominantly young women. And you can find pictures online of young women activists in Chile and Argentina marching naked to protest illegal abortion, to protest violence against women. What's fascinating is that those feminist movements that are happening in the street are not well connected to the women legislators, right? The women legislators are professional politicians. They share many of the same ideological goals as the young women that are in the streets, but they're not necessarily collaborating or in dialogue with each other. So there's many different kinds of feminism sort of happening in different moments. And I think we can be critical about the lack of collaboration and connection, but I think we could also think about, you know, professional politicians are making it work in their world, street activists are making it work in their world, and there is sort of a shared spirit, even if there's not shared strategy.
Well, I feel like we could just go on for hours. I wish we could go on for hours. I'm learning so much. I'm just so grateful for all of you being here with us and sharing your expertise and your time. It's really encouraging to hear a lot of these things and to remember actually that politicians are professionals who are doing a job. I think we often kind of equate them to like demigods, and we think that they need to have this purity around them and that there's a way we need to set them apart from a normal individual. But this is actually very humanizing to hear this conversation. And I'm very grateful for that perspective, especially at this moment in time when there's just so much upheaval, I think, in all of our lives, no matter where we are. So I am going to thank all of you one more time, and I'm going to thank all of our attendees for coming and sharing this hour with us. If you have any further questions or things that didn't get covered, feel free to send me an email. We will be sending out a feedback form where we would love to hear your thoughts on all of this. And you can find, you know, the names and contact emails for all of our distinguished guests on our event page. So thank you again to everyone and have a fantastic evening. Happy Women's History Month.
Bye.